The first sound I heard that morning wasn't my alarm. It was metal scraping against the front door like someone was forcing a screwdriver into the lock. At first, I thought maybe a neighbor was doing repairs outside, but the noise kept getting louder, so I walked to the front window and lifted the curtain just enough to see the porch, and that's when my stomach dropped. A man I had never seen before was kneeling in front of my door with a toolbox, slowly removing the deadbolt like he owned the place. I opened the door halfway and asked what he thought he was doing. He barely looked up. "Changing the locks," he said calmly. I actually laughed because I thought he had the wrong house. "You definitely do," I told him. But then he looked up at me and said something that made my chest tighten instantly. "No, this is the right address. The new owners want the locks changed before noon." Behind me was the house I had grown up in, my bed upstairs, my clothes in the closet, photo albums from when I was a kid still sitting in the hallway cabinet, and that was the moment I realized something terrifying. My father had already sold our house while I was still living inside it. The house sat on a quiet suburban street where almost nothing dramatic ever happened. The kind of neighborhood where people waved at each other while walking their dogs and kids rode bikes in slow circles in the middle of the road without anyone worrying about traffic. I had lived there almost my entire life, and every room carried some small memory that felt permanently stitched into the walls. The pantry door still had faint pencil lines from when my dad used to measure my height every birthday, and even though the marks were faded, I could still remember the exact years they were made. The living room still had the old upright piano near the window where my mom used to sit and play in the evenings before my parents divorced when I was 13. After the divorce, my father kept the house, and he always told me the same thing whenever the topic came up. No matter what happens, this place stays in the family. I believed him completely, which is why after finishing college, I moved back for a while to save money before getting my own apartment. My dad was rarely around anymore because his job had started sending him out of town almost every week, so most of the time I had the entire house to myself. Looking back now, there were small things in the weeks before that morning that should have felt strange but didn't at the time. The last time my father visited, he walked slowly through every room like he was studying something. He opened closets, checked windows, and even took photos with his phone. When I asked what he was doing, he just said he was keeping records. I didn't question it because it was his house after all. But standing on the porch that morning, watching a stranger remove the lock from the front door, suddenly made those memories feel very different. The locksmith eventually paused long enough to show me the work order he had been given, and printed clearly at the top of the page was the address of the house I was standing in front of. According to the document, the property had officially been transferred to new owners 3 days earlier. 3 days. That meant my father had signed the paperwork, sold the house, and completed the transfer without ever mentioning a single word about it to me. I remember standing there on the porch, holding that piece of paper while the locksmith calmly installed the new lock, like this was just another routine stop in his workday. That was the moment the place I had always called home suddenly felt like somewhere I wasn't supposed to be anymore. If you think that moment was shocking, wait until you hear what my father said when I finally got him on the phone. Standing in the driveway, staring at the bright red sold sign felt surreal, like I had accidentally stepped into someone else's story instead of my own. My first instinct was confusion, like maybe there had been some mistake with the paperwork or the address. My second instinct was panic. I pulled out my phone and called my father immediately. The call went straight to voicemail. I called again, voicemail again. By the third call, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. Meanwhile, the locksmith finished his job, closed his toolbox, and drove away like nothing unusual had happened. I was still standing there trying to process what I had just been told when my phone finally rang. My father's name appeared on the screen, and I answered so quickly I barely gave the call time to connect. The first thing I asked him was the only question that mattered. Did you sell the house? There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that tells you the answer before anyone actually says it. Then he sighed and said, "Yeah, I did." I waited for an explanation or at least some kind of apology, but what he said next felt even worse. It was a really good offer. That was it, just a simple business explanation delivered in the same calm tone someone might use when talking about selling an old car. I asked him why he hadn't told me beforehand, and he hesitated for a moment before finally admitting something that made the entire situation start to make sense in the worst possible way. A year earlier, he had taken out a large loan using the house as collateral to invest in a business deal with a friend. The deal failed, the debt didn't. When the bank started pressuring him to repay the loan, selling the house quickly was the easiest way to get out of trouble, and warning me beforehand would have slowed the sale down. In other words, the reason I never knew the house was being sold was because my father needed the money more than he needed to warn his own daughter. But the part that stayed with me the longest wasn't the phone call. It was what happened during the 5 days I had left in that house. Later that afternoon, someone from the investment company called and explained that their firm had purchased the property and planned to renovate it before putting it back on the market. And although their voice sounded polite, every sentence felt carefully rehearsed, like they'd made this same call many times. They told me contractors were scheduled to begin work the following week and asked if I could remove my belongings before then. When I asked how much time I had, the answer was simple: 5 days. 5 days to pack up 22 years of memories. Those 5 days passed in a strange blur, where every room I entered felt heavier than the last, because I knew I was seeing it for the final time. The pantry door with the height marks, the living room piano by the window, the hallway where I once crashed my bike into the wall when I was 8 years old and left a dent that my dad never bothered to fix. Meanwhile, my father called a few times during those days, and every conversation sounded almost identical. He talked about housing markets, property values, and how lucky he was that the buyers were willing to close the deal quickly. It sounded less like he was talking to his daughter and more like he was explaining a successful investment strategy to a coworker. By the time the 5th day arrived, the house was completely empty, just bare walls and dusty floors where furniture used to sit. I carried the final box out to my car and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, staring at the front door, the same door where I had watched a stranger change the locks only days earlier. That house had always felt permanent to me, like it would still be standing there years from now, no matter how much the rest of my life changed. But in the end, it turned out to be something much simpler than that. To me, it had been a home. To my father, it had been collateral. And if stories like this remind you how quickly trust can disappear, make sure you like and subscribe, because the next story might surprise you even more.